Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Game 3 from the 2013 World Championship. Game 3, much more exciting than the first two games. If you recall from the first two games, both of them draws, and both of them lasted just a handful of moves, and were over even before they really began. So to start Game 3, we have Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces. Anand defends with the black pieces. Magnus Carlsen decides to start out with something similar that we saw in Game 1 with the ready opening with the knight here to f3. Again, really can transpose into a lot of different openings, which Magnus Carlsen really likes. And we see very similar, we see this pawn to d5, but as we didn't see before, we see this early push forward with this pawn here to c4. So right away you can see Magnus Carlsen looking to change things up right away. Didn't really like how the first game went. Obviously, drawing after 16 moves was not what he wants to do, as the white pieces wants to play a little bit more aggressive. And so that's exactly what we see. After the pawn coming here to c4, the queen coming here to a4, pretty much signaled from the get-go that this was going to be a very different game than we've seen from the first two games. Black now responds, knight to c6, again kind of blocking the check, getting another piece involved into the game. So we have the bishop here to g2, and again both sides fianchettoing their bishops here on g7 and g2. We've seen a lot of the hyper-modern defense as far as trying to control the center of the board with these minor pieces. We've seen a lot of fianchettoing the bishops to both this g7 and this g2 square early on into the tournament. Now we see knight to c3, and this is kind of a after the pawn pushes forward to e7 or to e5 here. This is kind of a reverse Sicilian dragon. So white's kind of having the setup of a Sicilian defense dragon style, if you will, if you're familiar with that defense. And black kind of has the center control of the board with it, his pawn here on e5. He has the fianchetto bishop here on g7 kind of protecting it. He also has this knight here on c6. So it kind of has the roles reversed right now. Now from here, white decides to go ahead and take back that material on c4. Was really just going to be taken sooner or later, and so as you can tell from both sides, they are equal in material. Kind of going into, they're still in book right now as far as the lines that they're going after. As Anand said, they're not flying blind yet. So all these moves they've kind of studied up, and they're just trying to figure out the different variations that they want to play. But they're not really thinking outside of what they've already prepared for these tournaments at this point in the game. Black now brings his knight to e7. Probably a little better square than, if we see knight to f6, then we could, white could play knight to g5, putting pressure, threatening this queen here to f7, checkmate. From here you might see king castling, but then after the bishop coming and, the pawn you're capturing, the queen capturing here on c6, this is just a much tougher situation for black to be in. And so because of that, black can instead of bringing his, knight here to the common f6 square, instead decides to go ahead and play it here to this e7 square. This does allow him to still castle on the king side, but still allows Anand to, protect this knight here on c6 with this knight here on e7. So Magnus is going to go ahead and castle on the king side, and so we see the same thing from Anand here on the black side. And then we see the pawn coming here to d3, wanting to get this bishop outside of the pawn chain and get him involved into the action. Something that can be very difficult, especially early on for white, is to get this dark square bishop involved into the action. And now we see pawn here to h6, and then bishop here to d2. So Magnus Carlsen has completed development. Early on, he's connected his rooks, and so he can now go into the middle game and start to see if he can find a weakness in black's position. Now the knight's going to come to d4, and afterwards, in the press conference, Magnus Carlsen said that he actually wasn't prepared for this knight to d4. Kind of caught him off guard. There was a few moves that he talked about. This knight to d4 was one of those moves. He decides to just go ahead and take, and then after takes, that the knight just comes over here to e4. Still wants to make sure it's centralized, but it is being attacked, so it does need to move. Now the pawn comes to c6. It can, later on, push forward if he wants to an attack, but doesn't want to just kind of keep this open right here with all his pawns on a7, b7, and c7. So now the bishop comes here to b4. This is one of the moves that I think Magnus Carlsen somewhat made of a mistake, and he even said after the match that bishop to b4 was probably not his best move, because the next move from Anand right here with his bishop to e6, really there's no great squares for this queen to come to. It can't come back here. It's not going to come to either of these squares right here. Again, this pawn on c5 is blocking this outpost here on b5, and it can no longer come over here because he's kind of blocked by the bishop. So it's kind of forced to retreat, kind of back here to c2 or c1 are the only options. This would be very different if you come back and say, okay, from this position, instead of bringing the bishop here to b4, which isn't really extremely active right now unless he just wants to go ahead and exchange off one of his bishops, which you usually don't see too often in a game with high-level players. But you could see, pawn to a4. He still has some pretty active pieces on the queen side, and so starting to push forward with a4. Both of the king sides are pretty safe right now, but starting to push forward, with a4 while you have active pieces makes a lot more sense. In the particular game, though, we see Magnus Carlsen play this bishop here to b4 after the bishop here to e6, which is a great little move. Again, getting your pieces involved into the game and gaining tempo to force your opponent back. Now after the queen comes back here to c1, now we see bishop here to d5. And so if you kind of look at this situation, again, black has kind of gone from this defensive, I'm trying to get my pieces involved into the game, all of a sudden to, okay, they kind of are controlling the center of the board, and they're now putting pressure on their opponents. Magnus Carlsen now decides to play a4. In my opinion, it's a little bit later than he should have. He doesn't quite have as many pieces involved, with his queen back here in c1. This a4 is just not having as much pressure as he wants onto the game. So now we see pawn here to b6, getting ready if he wants to kind of solidify this entire pawn chain with b5. Also stopping, the pawn pushing any further, to a5. And now Magnus Carlsen decides to go ahead and exchange this bishop here on e7 with this knight. So going through the rest of the game, Anand's going to have these doubled bishop, which can be very, very dangerous, especially if Anand can kind of open up the board, get a lot of these pawns off the board so they can pretty much control the entire board. And Magnus Carlsen on the white side is going to be stuck with a bishop and a knight, which can be very dangerous in the right circumstance. So as we go further, the queen's going to recapture, no real other move. Now the pawn comes to a5 after the queen is moved, doesn't quite have the defenders. So the rook's now going to come to b8. Obviously, you don't want to just take right away. And so now the rook's going to swing over to e1. Again, more likely to push this e pawn up than he is this f pawn, especially with both the bishops on the board. If they centralize that dark square bishop, that's going to start to put a lot of pressure. So you want to make sure that you have some king side safety. So now we see the rook swing over to c8. Again, black really has more of the pawns on the queen side, so he can really start to push if he wanted to with that queen side advantage with his pawns. So now we see after the pawn takes and the pawn recaptures right here, we kind of look at, again, both sides still equal in material, so it's still fairly even. Black still kind of dominates the center of the board, but white does control this a file, which can be extremely important. And white really needs to get his pieces a little bit more active. This knight in the center is very good. His queen on c1 is not doing a whole lot. Both sides have safe kings. So all in all, a fairly equal game right now. Now we see the queen come to f4. Again, pretty centralized square. No real other places for the queen to go to. So, this does make some sense. Now we have the rook coming over here to d8. Now, we have to keep in mind that this bishop here right now is not so much protected by this rook, because if this rook swings down here, then the queen can swing up here and take this rook on b8. So that's something just to keep in mind. This bishop's not being attacked right now, but it's something that Magnus Carlsen could look to do. If he moves this knight anywhere, he then could take the bishop, and the bishop, this pawn would have to take back, and there would be doubled pawns because, again, the rook could not take back right away because it's inherently protecting both this rook and this bishop, and this rook here on b8 would fall. So just some things to think about as far as Magnus Carlsen's looking at the board. He does have some tactics that he can really get into if his opponent falls into a mistake. Now the pawn's going to push forward to h4, which I really like. Again, we've already talked about that Anand has the queenside advantage. He has more pawns over here. It's going to be easy for him to attack. He can always swing his queen over here to b4 if he wants to be pretty aggressive, really attack this pawn here on b2. So Magnus Carlsen recognizes this and says, if I'm going to have any sort of counterplay, more than likely it's going to be on the king side. And so he decides to go ahead and start pushing forward with h4. And now we see the king come here to h7. Again, wants to have some sort of protection. Again, if pieces start falling off, you want to also have your king near the center of the board going into the endgame. And now we see knight to d2. I probably would have preferred seeing something, pawn to h5. Again, if you're going to attack the king side, you can always continue with that. Now we could see the pawn push forward with g5, and then the queen comes back here to c1. But again, this is going to be a nice little square for this pawn here on h5, and then again later, Magnus Carlsen is threatening some pieces. He can always get his other pieces involved into the game, but this pawn here on h5 is definitely going to be a good square. Unfortunately, decides to play, I would consider more of a passive move. Plays this knight to d2, but it does also open up what we were talking about, where the bishop takes here on d5, and then this rook here on b8 is protected by this rook here on d8. So instead, we see Anand play a nice little move, centralizing his dark square bishop, attacking this queen, so he no longer has to worry. This rook is now free to protect this bishop here, forcing this queen back, and now after the pawn on h5, which again, white, my guess is probably wanted to have his pawn there if he could take it back, but now forces the queen back here to h3, and then after the bishop here on h6, on e6, again just forcing back this queen here on h1. If you have a queen, you typically don't want to have it in the corner of the board, being trapped by a pawn structure and your bishop. Now it does have a bishop in front of it, so he can kind of attack, but Anand can just play this pawn to c5, which he does, and then all of a sudden, you have this barrel, but it's not really attacking anything. And in this case, you just have a queen that's not doing much. So if we look at the board, Anand is definitely winning the game at this moment. He has a much more active position. He has the double bishop pair, which can be extremely dangerous. Both of his rooks are completely active. His queen is much more involved into the game. It's not in the corner on h1, so things are definitely looking up for black. So now we see the knight come to e4. Again, it moved back to d2, and now it sets e4. And the king's going to come over here to g7. Wants to make sure that it can't fall to any checks, by knight here to g5 or any of that. But the knight's going to come here to g5, no longer in check, and Anand just decides to start pushing forward. Again, he has that queenside advantage that we talked about with the pawn, so he's going to kind of push that. And then we see pawn here to e3, and after the capture, the rook's going to swing up here to e3. And this is one of those cases where, I feel like Anand really needs to just take this pawn here on b2. Afterwards, that was one of the most asked questions from people in the gallery. After the match, you can ask questions to Anand and Carlsen, and everyone was kind of curious, why black didn't take this pawn here on b2, because it was just kind of hanging out there for him. Magnus Carlsen even seemed questioned that, why he didn't think this pawn was taken. Anand said he couldn't find any good continuation as far as he thought white had good compensation for this, but all in all, I think bishop takes on b2 is completely safe and obviously gains material going into the endgame. You could just start exchanging pieces off, especially since you kind of have all the momentum with your bishops. I think that would have been better. In the particular game, though, just decides to play bishop to d4, centralizing his bishop, but again, not doing too much. Now, after the rook came to e2, I thought there may be another opportunity later on to attack, but decided to go ahead and halt that for right now. Decides to instead push forward with his pawns. And now we see the knight take the bishop here on e6. So black no longer has the double bishop pair, but still has a very active bishop here on d4. And after the pawn takes here, this also allows black to bring his rook over here to f8. And then there's now two attackers with that bishop and the rook here on f2. So that's definitely something that Anand can come to later on if he wants to. Now we see the bishop come here to e4, again centralizing this bishop. Again, it's not really attacking anything else on the board, so getting it away from this square here on g2 is definitely good. So we see the pawn take, and now the rook swing over here to d2. And now the queen comes into b4, starting to put some more pressure on the queen side, which we already talked about. And now this rook's going to swing over to d1. And then we see the bishop take on b2. Could have also played, something else. Did have some other options. Could have swung over here if he wanted to on, f8 right away. But good that he's actually taking the material that he probably should have taken a while ago. Now the queen's going to come to f3, wants to get more involved. Again, being here on h1 was not doing a whole heck of a lot of anything. So definitely something that Magnus Carlsen needed to do. Now it brings the bishop back here to f6, kind of blocking stuff off, and then we see the rook take here. Again, black is still up in material. He does have this pawn advantage, so it's going to be very important for Anand to actually take advantage of this. And then the rook takes here, and then we see the rook recapture. And then the rook's going to swing over to d8. And this is kind of one of those points in the game where I feel like Anand had the advantage. He looked at it, and then, again, even in the questions afterwards, he said he didn't want to get too tactical in the game. My guess is he thinks Magnus Carlsen may be a better tactical player, but he had bishop here to d4. This is a great centralizing square for this bishop. He can always push forward with pawn to e5, really having a nice little outpost, just dominating the center of the board. Both of these are on dark squares, so this bishop here, this light square bishop, is not going to have any sort of pressure on this. This is going to be very good. It also blocks off a lot of the mobility for this rook here on d3. This rook, if he wants to control anything, is going to have to move a couple squares. He's going to have to come back here, to d1 and then kind of move around. It's going to be awkward. And again, from Black's standpoint, he can move this rook around the board. Again, he's probably going to want to play this pawn to e5. It is being protected by the queen right now, but again, just solidifying in the center of the board. I think this was an easy find. I'm not really sure why Anand decided not to do it. Instead, in the game, he actually decided to play rook to d8, which in my opinion, as you'll see later on to the game, this is a very drawish move. This pretty much gives up, in my opinion, all of the momentum and the goodness that Black had in the game. So from here, White decided to go ahead and take, and then after the bishop took, bishop now comes down to d3. The queen came over to d4. Again, that just kind of saying, hey, I'm going to centralize my piece, but I'm just going to give back the material that I was up. I don't even want to try to attempt to hold on to it. And so both sides are pretty much even going into the end game. There's no real advantage that either side has. And so as we kind of go forward, Anand wants to just go ahead and trade off pieces if he can. Magnus Carlsen decides he doesn't want to have a more active king right now. If he were to take right away, this would definitely be bad for Magnus Carlsen. It takes him a few moves to get his king involved, where the king right here on f6 is a lot more involved into the game. So decides to go ahead and play this queen here to b7, and then kind of thwarting this attack with bishop here to e7. But again, this bishop can't move anymore. And so a few moves, Magnus Carlsen decides to get his king involved into the action a little bit more. Then a few moves later, and now the exchange of queens, and then again both sides really just don't have a lot of material left. Everyone was kind of waiting for them to just shake hands, and then a few moves later they decide to go ahead and end the game right here. Insufficient material for a checkmate, and so after 51 moves we have a draw. Now the good news is two things in my opinion. One is we actually got to move 51, which is a lot more than we've gotten even from the first two games combined. And also, if you've seen the players' demeanor after the matches, they really look like they want to win. Magnus Carlsen looked really frustrated that he could not come up with a better plan and actually win, especially as white. He's now played white 2 times. So I feel like these players want to win. I'm excited that in Game 3 they actually tried for the win instead of the first 2 games where they just kind of moved their pieces and then shook hands and then had an early dinner. They actually tried in this game, in my opinion. So I'm hoping that the next few games are going to be exciting, and we'll actually have some wins across the board, because those are always good. So hopefully you guys enjoyed Game 3. Hopefully this is a sign of good things to come in the future, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.